So imagine this. You wake up, check the news, and suddenly the place where, well, almost everything electronic comes from is facing huge new taxes.
Yeah.
That's kind of the jolt we're unpacking today.
Exactly. We're looking at a potentially massive shift in where your next iPhone gets put together.
Yeah.
Away from China, heading towards India.
When it sounds like it's not just a simple business move. There's trade policy, geopolitics. What kicked this whole thing off, these new tariffs?
That's the trigger, yeah. New U.S. reciprocal tariffs specifically aimed at goods from China and smartphones. They're right in the middle of it.
Okay, break that down for us. These reciprocal tariffs. What are we actually talking about here?
Well, think back to April 5th, 2025. The U.S. introduced this policy targeting countries with what they called unbalanced trade. It started as sort of a baseline 10% tariff.
10%, okay, that's already something.
But here's the kicker for Apple. Because of how it works, for smartphones coming out of China, that 10% somehow translates into a duty between, get this, 20 and possibly even 50%.
Wait, 20 to 50%? On an iPhone?
Yeah.
So a $1,000 phone could suddenly cost, what, $200 to $500 more just in import duties?
Precisely. That's a massive hit for a company selling millions of iPhones, absorbing that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's just not really feasible, is it?
No way, so they had to react. And the reaction sounds drastic. Move all U.S.-bound iPhone assembly to India by the end of 2026. That feels incredibly fast.
It is fast. But,
Yeah.
There were whispers, maybe some groundwork being laid. Remember back in March 2025, Foxconn and Tata shipped about $2 billion worth of iPhones already built in India?
So that was like a test run, a proof of concept.
Looks that way. It seems like a pretty crucial trial to see if India was, ready for the big leagues, so to speak.
So publicly, Apple saying nothing, no comment. Classic Apple. But behind the scenes.
No, you bet. Tim Cook was apparently doing some heavy-duty lobbying in D.C. trying to navigate this. And at the same time, their suppliers must have been absolutely scrambling.
Scrambling how?
Retooling, shifting resources, figuring out the logistics to support this massive pivot to India. This isn't like flipping a switch. It's a huge coordinated effort.
Okay, so the why is clear. The tariff shock forced their hand. But let's dig into the how and where. India. Can they really absorb this? What's their current iPhone output look like?
Right now, in 2024, they were already doing a fair bit, around 40 million units, which, interestingly, is about a third of what the U.S. market demands.
A third. So there's a big gap to fill. What are Apple's expansion plans looking like?
They're ambitious. The targets we're hearing are something like 55 million a year by late 2025, then jumping to 70 million by mid-2026, and finally hitting maybe 85 million by the end of 2026.
That's a steep ramp up. But there are bumps in the road, challenges India needs to overcome.
Definitely. A few key things. First, the yield rates, especially for the fancy Pro models. They're currently running maybe 3 to 5 percentage points lower in India than China's best lines.
Meaning slightly more phones need fixing or don't pass quality checks first time.
Exactly. It adds cost and complexity. Then there's just getting things in and out. The port in Chennai, a key hub, is apparently quite congested.
Bottlenecks.
Yeah. Leading them to use expensive air freight more often than they'd probably like just to keep things moving.
And what about the components themselves? The screens, cameras, chips? They don't just magically appear in India, right?
That's a really critical point. Even if assembly moves, the parts are still coming largely from China, Taiwan, South Korea, those sophisticated bits. India doesn't make most of them yet.
So the reliance on the old supply chain nodes is still there, creating potential weak spots.
Absolutely. It's not a clean break, more like shifting the final step, but the underlying dependencies remain, at least for now.
This feels like more than just business logistics. There's a big geopolitical angle here. Why India? Why now? What makes it seem safer than China for a company like Apple?
Well, for Western companies, India offers a few things. You've got a democratic system. English is widely used in business. Legal contracts are more familiar territory.
Less unpredictable, maybe?
Perhaps. And crucially, no immediate threat of U.S. sanctions hanging over operations there, unlike the situation with China. Plus, while IP protection isn't perfect, it's generally seen as improving in India.
Yeah. Compared to the risks people associate with China, now sudden COVID-style lockdowns, the government potentially restricting exports, worries about data.
Right. All those factors add up. So even with India's own logistical hurdles, the geopolitical risk calculation seems to be shifting. Lower risk, even if it's more complex operationally in some ways.
Let's talk economics. Winners and losers. China first. What does this iPhone exodus mean for them?
It could definitely hurt. You're looking at potentially idle factories, especially those big Foxconn campuses. That could mean tens of thousands of workers furloughed or laid off.
Wow, tens of thousands.
Yeah, and the hit to export revenue, estimates are floating around maybe $30 billion. That's not insignificant.
Okay, so China potentially loses big. What about India? What's the upside there?
Jobs, mainly. We're talking maybe 40,000 direct manufacturing jobs in the assembly plants themselves.
40,000, that's a lot.
It is. And then there's the ripple effect suppliers, logistics, transport. That could add another, say, 150,000 to 200,000 jobs indirectly.
And I guess those manufacturing jobs pay better than other options.
Generally, yes. Often 2 or 3 times what someone might earn from farming in the same region. So it could help chip away at poverty, though it's not a magic bullet, of course.
It's interesting how quiet the main players have been publicly. Tim Cook, Xi Jinping, any word from the top?
Apple, as we said, officially silent, though there was that leaked report about Cook calling the Commerce Secretary, warning about, potential price hikes if the tariffs stuck.
Understandable. And in China.
President Xi publicly called the tariffs unilateral bullying. Standard stuff. But interestingly, reports say he specifically avoided mentioning Apple by name.
Why do you think that is?
Possibly trying to downplay China's reliance on those Apple jobs to project strength, maybe, even if they're feeling the pressure internally.
Okay, so bringing it back home. For you, listening in the U.S., what's the practical impact? Are iPhones about to get more expensive? Harder to find?
Well, in the near term, probably yes to both, at least to some extent. As India ramps up production through, say, late 2025 into 2026, you might see shortages of specific models, especially during busy times like the holidays.
And prices.
Yeah, likely going up. The extra logistics costs, maybe slightly lower efficiency initially. It could add maybe $20 to $40 to the price tag. It's an estimate, but plausible.
So if prices go up and maybe the exact model you want isn't available, how do people adapt?
You might see the secondhand market get a boost. People holding onto phones longer or buying refurbished. And those carrier installment plans, they could become even more attractive to spread out the higher cost.
Now, China surely won't just sit back and watch this happen without responding somehow, right? What counter moves could they make?
They have options. One lever is rare earth minerals vital for electronics. China dominates production. They could potentially tighten export quotas, making things difficult for everyone, including Apple's suppliers.
Squeeze the supply chain further up.
Exactly. Or they could apply more subtle pressure. Maybe encourage delays from component suppliers, screen makers, battery producers shipping parts to India.
Make life difficult for the Indian factories.
Right. And then there's always the possibility of making things tougher for Apple services within China itself. iCloud, the App Store. That's still a huge market for Apple.
This definitely shakes things up. For listeners interested in the investment angle, where might the opportunities or risks lie?
Well, obvious candidates are Indian manufacturers involved in this, like Tata or Dixon. There could be growth there. Also, any U.S. efforts to onshore chip production might get another push.
Makes sense. What else?
Given the reliance on air freight, maybe cargo airlines could see a bump. On the flip side, you might look at things like rare earth ETFs as a hedge, or even consider shorting some China-based electronics manufacturers who might lose out. But that's obviously higher risk.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. It's amazing how a trade dispute can trigger such a rapid, potentially massive reshaping of a global supply chain like Apple's.
It really is. The iPhone, this device in millions of pockets, is suddenly at the center of this huge geopolitical and economic story. Shows how interconnected everything is.
Absolutely. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? We've talked about final assembly moving, but what if the focus shifts? Could we see tariffs eventually targeting those critical components, the screens, the chips, even if they're assembled in India? What would that mean for this whole strategy?
That's a really good question. It raises the stakes even higher and questions the long-term stability of any single alternative location.
Lots to keep watching. Thanks for breaking it all down.